before we begin, at the end of the last episode, I said I was going to take you inside WellSafe's strategic advice process, and we are going to do that. But since recording that episode, I had a conversation with a family that I haven't been able to stop thinking about because it highlighted something about international planning that I think needs to come first, and it has very little to do with tax. One of the biggest misconceptions about leaving Australia is that the financial side is the hardest part. It isn't. Recently, I spoke with a husband and wife who perfectly illustrated this. They were successful business owners with 2 daughters. They were building a second business that they hoped would one day create real wealth and freedom for their family. When they first contacted WellSafe, they thought they wanted to talk about offshore structures, international banking, and tax. But after about 20 minutes, something interesting happened. The conversation stopped being about tax and it became about their children. The youngest was finishing school. Their eldest was preparing for university. The wife loved what she did and couldn't imagine giving that up. And as the conversation unfolded, something became very clear. Financially, exploring an international strategy made sense, but that wasn't what was really holding them back. It was their children, their family, and the future they had always imagined. And I think that perfectly captures what so many successful Australian families are experiencing today. The real question isn't, can we create a better financial future? It's, can we create a better financial future without sacrificing our family? And the answer isn't found by forcing your family into a tax strategy. It's found by designing international strategy around the life your family is actually trying to create. Hi, I'm Vina White, CEO of WellSafe. In this series, I've been explaining the complete wealth control system and how successful Australian business owners, founders, investors, and families can build a more internationally diversified financial future. But there's a side of international planning that hardly anyone talks about, the family side, because leaving Australia isn't simply a tax decision. It's about your children, your marriage, your parents, your business, your identity, and ultimately the life you're trying to create. Ironically, for many successful families, the financial possibilities can be relatively easy to understand. Greater asset protection, greater international diversification, potentially lower taxation through appropriate international planning, greater flexibility over where and how you live. But understanding the financial opportunity doesn't necessarily make the decision easy, because eventually someone asks, but what about the kids? And that's when the real conversation begins. Sometimes what you're struggling to leave isn't actually Australia. It's the future you thought you were going to have. Retiring in the same home, watching your children build their lives nearby, and even when another future may ultimately give your family greater freedom, letting go of that picture can still be incredibly emotional. I've seen this many times with Australian families considering international future. Financially, you can understand the opportunity, but then someone asks, what about our daughter who's going to university? What about our son who's still at school? What about our aging parents? What about the business? What happens to the life we've already built? And suddenly, you're not talking about tax anymore. You're talking about life. And this is where one of the biggest misconceptions about leaving Australia needs to change. People assume if we leave Australia, we have to give everything up. You don't. International planning is really all or nothing. That couple I mentioned at the beginning didn't need me to tell them, pack your bags and leave Australia. They needed to understand that there was a middle ground. Their youngest could potentially finish an important stage of school. Their eldest could continue with university in Australia. The wife didn't necessarily have to give up the work she loved. Their business could evolve over time. Some Australian assets might remain, others might eventually be sold. One spouse might initially spend more time overseas than the other. And the family might take 2 years to make the transition, or 5, perhaps longer. They didn't need to make one enormous decision. They needed to understand the options available to them. That's not indecision, that's planning. Because a successful international transition doesn't have to happen in one enormous leap. It can happen in stages, and those stages can be designed around your family. When that couple first spoke with WellSafe, they were essentially trying to answer one enormous question. Do we stay in Australia or do we leave? But that's really the first question that needs to be answered. A better question is, what options can we create for our family? Because planning doesn't commit you to leaving Australia. Planning creates the option to leave. They are two completely different things. You may relocate in 2 years, 5 years, perhaps longer. Or you may ultimately decide that a different pathway is right for your family. But when you understand what's possible, something changes. The decision no longer feels like stay or go. Instead, you begin asking, what could our future actually look like? And that gives a family something incredibly valuable. Time. Time for a husband and wife to become aligned. Time for children to finish important stages of their lives. Time for the business to evolve. Time to explore different countries. Time to ask questions. Time to understand what's possible. And sometimes time simply to imagine a different future. Because you don't need every answer before you begin planning. The first step isn't moving, it's alignment. Because once you understand the direction your family is considering, the strategy can begin to be designed around that direction. And that's why international planning should never begin with which country has the lowest tax rate or where should we establish a company. Those questions may eventually matter, but before we talk about any of that, I want to understand you and your family. Who wants to move? Who doesn't? What stage are the children at? What does each spouse want their life to look like? What happens to the business? What are you actually trying to create? Because there isn't one perfect international structure for every family. There is only the strategy that's appropriate for your circumstances. The structure should support the strategy, and the strategy should support the life you're trying to create. Your family shouldn't have to fit around the structure. The structure should fit around your family. And perhaps this is the most important thing I can tell a family considering an international future. You don't have to have your entire life worked out today. You don't need to know exactly where you will eventually live. You don't need to know precisely what will happen to every business or asset. And you don't have to decide whether you're leaving Australia forever. Those decisions can evolve. International planning isn't about predicting every detail of the next 10 years. It's about understanding the direction you're considering and creating enough flexibility that your family has choices along the way. That's the difference between making decisions under pressure and designing a future while you still have time. If you're watching this and you've thought financially it makes sense, but what about the children? What about our parents? What about our business? What about the life we've built? You're asking exactly the right questions, because leaving Australia isn't simply a financial decision, it's a family transition. And that transition deserves a strategy designed around the life you're actually trying to create. The couple I mentioned at the beginning didn't need to decide that day whether they were leaving Australia. They needed to understand their options. And once they did, the decision became very different. It wasn't simply, do we stay or do we go? It became, what future do we want to create for our family, and how do we design a pathway towards it? That's what complete wealth control is really about. Creating enough control over your financial life that your family has choices. At WellSafe, our clients have the appetite to create generational wealth, build a lasting legacy, and enjoy greater freedom, lifestyle, and sovereignty for themselves and their families. And sometimes the first step towards that future isn't deciding to leave Australia. It's understanding what's possible, because the best time to create options is long before you need them. And remember, freedom is designed.